talking about Cyprian of Carthage. If you ask your average church member, the odds are they probably haven't ever heard of Cyprian, which is a shame because he's probably one of the more influential early Christian writers. He has a huge influence on Augustine. In fact, writing from North Africa in Carthage, he has a major dispute with the Bishop of Rome, and yet, despite this disagreement, he's remembered by all parties, those in Rome and abroad, as the hero of the faith. He dies as a martyr, so that really solidifies his legacy. And the rest of the Church of North Africa will really be a history of contesting who is the rightful heir to Cyprian. He is not only going to be remembered far and wide, we have his relics to this day because after Africa was conquered by the Arab expansion in 809, the Caliph of Baghdad actually presented gifts from Africa to Charlemagne, and that included an elephant and it included the relics of Cyprian. So Cyprian looms large in the imagination of Christians, mostly for his influence on how we understand the church. I mean, he veritably sets the blueprint for how ecumenical councils work, where each bishop is represented. But today, we're going to talk about his understanding of how wealth and poverty play into the Christian life. This could go into discussions about salvation, because it's sort of a working out of your salvation. And in fact, we need to talk about how this fits into questions of works versus grace. And we'll start there. But more than that, I want us to see sort of the logic and his understanding of what scriptures actually require of followers of Jesus. And I think this is a good picture of how many of the early Christians understood the Christian life. So, hope you enjoy this. Well, the title of the work that we are reading for today is called On Works and Alms. Now, when you say works, the warning lights in our Protestant head starts to go off because we're really nervous about works. We saw where this leads. Isn't this works righteousness, works salvation, where you end up just trying to win over God's favor, maybe even buy it with the selling of indulgences? Well, that's a fair question. And at the end of the day, I'm not going to try to claim that Cyprian is innocent of that charge. But I think the most important place to start is to say that no one was asking that question in Cyprian's day. Cyprian belongs to a time where he thinks that you are to imitate Christ. You are to follow Christ. And the good news is he's got a lot to say about grace and God's work in sending Christ to us, and how we would never be able to do this apart from the Spirit of Christ in us. So that sounds like a whole lot of grace, but just remember, he's not directly answering that question. He's asking, what should Christians do based on what Jesus taught? Now, when you start with that point, you still want to question, wait a minute, but has he gone too far? So let me do this. Let me just read you some of the opening passages and kind of ask what he's actually saying. Because I think he is people often jump to conclusions when reading some of this. With all of his emphasis on how works and giving alms saves, well, that sounds a lot like works righteousness, but let's look a little closer and not jump to conclusions. The very opening line, he actually talks about the mercy of God and how there's many and great divine benefits or gifts that God gives us. And if you go down about 10 lines later, he talks about this divine compassion. And then he adds to it this great, the translation says clemency, this great mercy. It's not our word grace, but it's pretty much there. It's a whole lot of talk of mercy and clemency and compassion. And then he says this is what's already taken place. And now there's even more abundant care that is provided for preserving man, humans, after he is already redeemed. So now, everything Clement says from this point forward is going to be talking about after redemption, after what we would probably call justification. So all of this great mercy and benefits and compassion and clemency, all that is what got us redeemed. Now what about what comes after? What are we supposed to do? So it seems he's clear on justification by mercy, clemency, compassion. But what about what comes next? Well, he's not done. Because even then he's going to go on and add, unless the divine mercy, coming once more in age, should open some way of securing salvation and pointing out works of justice and mercy, then the humans would never be saved. So even this is another act of what he calls divine mercy, grace. Is that as much grace in the way grace works that, say, Augustine and Martin Luther and John Calvin would want? Well, no, he's just not answering their questions. But he sure does have a lot of grace here. In fact, the next thing he adds is he says, he has a quote, and he says that as water extinguisheth fire, so almsgiving extinguisheth sin. So if this is echoing for Cyprian the language of baptism, the baptism itself extinguished the fire of Gehenna, of hell, he says. So then, he goes on and says, these almsgiving and acts of righteousness extinguish the flames of sin, the stuff in us. For Cyprian, it seems that almsgiving and these acts of righteousness are ways of purging sin out of us. They're spiritual disciplines because the heat and flame and passion of that sin nature is still in us even after our baptism. The water of baptism didn't cool or extinguish that sin, even though it did, in effect, cool the fires of hell for us, because God saved us, and now God gave us a way to work out our salvation, I think is maybe a fair way to say it. If you go to section 3 of the work, after talking about all of that, he talks once more about how kind divine mercy it is, and he found a way to heal people who have fallen back into sin even after they've been baptized. So you see, what is this mercy? This mercy is God gives us avenues of spiritual disciplines. The one he's talking about here is almsgiving, but he has a treatise on prayer, he has a treatise on lots of other things. These spiritual disciplines are ways that God uses, gifts God gives us, compassion, mercy, benefits God gives us to help us move from that internal belief in our salvation to the external living out and realizing of our salvation. Now, is that enough? Is that mean that there's not works righteousness in here somewhere? Well, again, I'm not saying that he hasn't fallen into the language of works righteousness or into some pitfall in lack of care, or maybe even deep down he really believes somehow he's earning rewards in earning salvation. But two last things I think in the big picture of this question is, one, what is his model of salvation? If you go back and watch the last video we did on Clement of Alexandria, we laid out different models, and Cyprian is clearly not just thinking in terms of justification. As we said, he starts there. He thinks that's already happened. But now he's talking about something else, like sanctification. And using the Latin language, that would be expected. He probably even still has the apparatus, the bigger picture to think about deification. So the idea here is not that you're saving yourself, justifying yourself, or even that you're getting yourself accepted to God and into God's presence. The idea is that these are the avenues through which God purges sin from us, the ongoing real sins in our life, that sin habit that we need to have tamed. So is this enough? Well, we'll wait for Martin Luther to come along and he can answer this question. But I think we ought to give Cyprian credit where credit is due, because the second thing is, even though it at times sounds like he's talking too much about works and reward, it's sort of hard to blame him when that's how most of the Bible talks. Even Jesus, even Paul can talk about works and reward. Now, it's not the kind of reward we get that we thought we're finally convincing God to love us. And yet God set up a system where those who do the things he asks of them, he rewards them. God sanctifies people. God blesses people. God has heavenly rewards to give people. And so what I'll do is at the end of this video, I'll just set up a slide of some of the verses you could look to if you wanted to compare how faithful is Cyprian being to the scriptures and to what has come before. But for now, let's give him the benefit of the doubt. He wants to believe that this is something God has done for the Christian, and yet he expects the Christian to work in accordance with God's will. Now, what does Cyprian want you to do? He wants you to give alms. How many alms? He wants you to give to the poor. Give what? Your possessions to the poor. How much? All of them. Now, where does he get that idea from? Well, you guessed it. He hears that in the teachings of Jesus. So if you look to section 7 of this work, this is where he quotes Jesus. He's been leading up to this. He knows Christians already know they should be people who follow Jesus. They should be people who care for the least of these. And he's got a lot of other proof texts from prophets and other passages, but he finally gets to the real heart of the matter. Jesus said, and he quotes him, "Sell your goods, your possessions, and give alms," or give to the poor. In fact, he goes on, "Don't lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust do corrupt, and thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourself treasures in heaven." Now, we all know this passage, and we've probably all heard this passage preached. You remember the rich young ruler comes, and he asks Jesus, "What must I do to be saved?" And Jesus' response sounds a lot like works righteousness. He says, "Go obey the law." Well, this young ruler says he has obeyed all the law since his youth. So one thing you lack, Jesus says, go sell your possessions, give to the poor. And then it says the rich young ruler went away greatly sad, for he was very wealthy. Now, you've probably heard this preached. We've already done a video on origin and allegory. You know how to allegorize this, so we don't take it literally. Jesus wasn't talking literally to all disciples. He was just talking to this one rich young ruler. This ruler claimed to have kept all the law, but look, he loved his money more than he loved God. He broke the first commandment, to have no other gods before God. You've heard that sermon, right? So it's not literally meant to be obeyed. Just that one ruler, maybe. But it's about your internal spiritual state. How do you cling to wealth, right? Well, Cyprian doesn't buy that. For one thing, he would say, we've missed something about the context of what he's quoting. The rich young ruler shows up in Luke chapter 18, but that's not what Cyprian is quoting here. Luke is quoting what Jesus says earlier in Luke chapter 12, verse 33. And it's clear he's quoting from there because of all the extras. There, Jesus says, sell your possessions and give to the poor, or give alms. And he goes on, and that's the verse where we heard, do not lay up for yourself treasures on earth, but lay up for yourself treasures in heaven. And if you look at Luke 12:33, that's not Jesus talking to one rich young ruler. That's Jesus talking to all the disciples. And so Cyprian thinks that his audience and that Christians want to be included in that category of Jesus' disciples. So Jesus says to all his disciples, go sell your possessions, give to the poor. Now, how many possessions? What exactly counts as possession? Do you get to keep a house, or is that a possession? Well, Cyprian doesn't ever try to completely lay this out for us, but it's a pretty radical claim. In fact, once he makes this claim, and once it's indisputable that this is what Jesus is teaching and requiring of his followers, then people start to just make the logical objections. Well, it couldn't be mean that literally because, so we need to come back and see what those logical objections are and see how Cyprian answers them. Now, once Cyprian says all Christians have to give their possessions away and give to the poor, people start to kind of raise their hand and say, wait, I object. What about this? What about that? And he goes through a series of answering them. And I'll summarize here. He knows that people are saying, first off, if I give all my possessions away, I'm going to be poor. How am I going to feed myself? How am I going to clothe myself? Answer, what Jesus said. You don't have to worry about your food or clothing. Look at the lilies of the field and the birds of the air. You're not supposed to be anxious about tomorrow or your life. So if you really trust Jesus, this objection doesn't count. Okay, objection number 2. What about my kids? And the question doesn't just seem to be feeding them. The question that is specific is, I need to plan. I need to leave an estate behind. I need to leave an inheritance. Well, Cyprian doesn't buy that either. Because for him, it's just an extension of what Jesus said for the individual. In fact, he takes it to the children's level, and he says if you have kids and you don't obey Jesus, you're committing a twofold sin. You're disobeying Jesus. Jesus said to trust him with your money, with your possessions, give to the poor, worry not about tomorrow, you're not trusting him. And second, you're teaching your kids not to trust him. So that's a double sin. It's a double whammy for Cyprian. He doesn't buy that objection at all. Okay, now wait a minute. What about if all Christians gave all their money away? Everybody's going to be poor, right? Who's going to take care of all the Christians? Cyprian's not worried about that one either. Go read the book of Acts. Luke, Jesus taught the disciples how to live this way. In Acts, they do live this way. And somehow, miraculously maybe, it works. But everyone shares all things in common, and there's no need among them. Well, then you might finally ask, wait a minute, if every Christian give their poor away, aren't they going to be dependent on others? Aren't they going to be a drain on society? How is this sustainable for the wider society? Well, Cyprian's not even imagining the wider society. The wider society is the Roman Empire, full with all of its idol worshippers and all of its demonic activity. Cyprian isn't out to restore society. He's out to live the Christian society. And here in the Christian society, it's not our job to fix the world. We're to be representatives in the world, but not to be of the world. So for Cyprian, this is also just a non-issue. If everyone in the church were doing exactly what everyone in the church was supposed to do, he's pretty sure God would take care of it. So much for those objections. Well, why is it that Cyprian is so sure about this, but it seems like we don't hear much about this at all today in our context? Well, that's a much bigger question than we can fully address here. But I think it is fair to say that we often let Christianity get bound up in whatever the culture is. And in our, at least American, Western culture, there's a lot bound up in making sure you have a house and 2 cars and enough clothes and enough inheritance. And there seems to be a real consumeristic culture that can even show up in Christianity, where the idea is you're supposed to be healthy, wealthy, and wise. And those who are must be blessed by God. And those who aren't must not be blessed by God. Well, that's a little too simplistic for biblical religion. That's not at all how the Bible portrays this, and that's not how it worked for Jesus or his followers. So let's just at least give Cyprian some credit here that he is a lot closer to the time of Jesus, and he's living in a time where Christians still take seriously this call that they're supposed to take up their cross and follow Jesus. And that is a life of martyrdom. Cyprian dies as a martyr, but most of them in his church do not. And yet they all feel this call. They all hear this message that it's a life of self-denial. And so as part of what it means to be a Christian, it's meaning you're willing to give up all you have. Now, how exactly that work, and again, what counts as possession, I'm not quite sure. Maybe you can keep your house. Maybe you can keep extra set of clothes. But you can't keep a Cadillac collection. I'm pretty sure about that. Augustine comes on a little bit later, and I told you he's very influenced by Cyprian. And like so many other things, Augustine has the luxury of being able to expand and think longer and more deeply about these issues that have come before him. And Augustine's able to take this and say, it's true, every Christian is called to a life of poverty. You cannot keep your own possessions. But Augustine has clear demarcations here. What life are you called to? And if you go back and watch our video on Thecla, there was a lot about celibacy and people who have chosen to live a life of self-denial. That is a calling, and it's not for everyone. Some people are called to marriage and called to be parents. But if you're not called to that, it's not fair to say that in the Bible, it teaches that every good Christian boy and girl will grow up to be a Christian mommy and daddy. That's not the case at all in the New Testament and early Christianity. There are different callings for different people. And Augustine applies that same logic to the idea of wealth. If you're called, say, to be a priest, like Augustine was, to be a bishop, a clergy, well, then you can't keep any of your possessions. You give it all away. And in his day, you lived in the church. Maybe you're called to be a monk or a nun, and you don't keep any of your own possessions. You give them all away, and you share all things in common with those in your monastery. And Augustine says, if you're called to be a husband or a wife, or if you're called to be a mother or a father, you still don't keep any of your own possessions. You give them all away. It's not yours. You start with your spouse, with your kids, and then in the abundance from there you give to others. You don't get to keep back your own collection of things, because your life is one of self-denial and one of service to others. So what Cyprian has done here, we started off worried that it looks like works righteousness, but to his credit, he thinks he is following in the way of Jesus. He thinks that this is what it means to be a follower of Christ, an imitator of Christ, and whatever the specific path or calling looks like. You may not die as a martyr. You may not have to be a single life. You may not have to give all your possessions away, literally becoming homeless. And yet, you're committed to whatever that calling is. And you're committed to that self-denial and that voluntary giving away of yourself and all that you have in the service of Christ.